everyone. Shall we get started? So my name's Imran Valodia. I'm the director of SCIS and also the Pro Vice Chancellor for Climate Sustainability and Inequality at WITS. It's a kind of great pleasure for us at SCIS to have you all here. I know that at least some of you have traveled a long way to be here. We have some folk from kind of embassies of the partner countries to this work, and I know we have a large audience online as well. So kind of really pleased to have you all here, and kind of looking forward to come to a detailed kind of interrogation and discussion of this fantastic work that's been done by all of you on the kind of issue of the issue of intersectionality. So when we started the center, we kind of officially launched SCIS in 2016, kind of, I think, but we were starting to think about this question from at least 2014, and I think from that time, this kind of question of of kind of intersectionality was very kind of prominent in how one should kind of think about the kind of questions of inequality. I think what was less clear and kind of something that we'd been grappling with for some time is that while we would all be quite supportive of the kind of idea that work on inequality should take a perspective of kind of intersectionality, quite what that meant practically and quite what that would mean kind of operationally from a research point of view was something that was not at all clear, and something that we'd been kind of grappling with at that time quite a lot. I think what you've all achieved through this project is to take forward that kind of debate, and I think this work that the kind of center's done in partnership with all of you has really kind of allowed us for the first time to think through how you would take a concept that we would all agree is important and actually put that in practice. So my own sense is that the work that's been done on this project is really path-breaking work that has kind of really advanced the kind of global ideas about how we think about inequality. And with that, I think I want to really say how grateful we are to all of you who've been part of this work, but also who've done the real kind of hard work in all of the countries that have been part of the study to kind of really congratulate you on what I think is a fantastic piece of work. I want to especially thank kind of Hannah's kind of Sibiwe and say party who've led this work inside the center, who've kind of coordinated all of the kind of international network that we've built to help us think through this issue. So a huge congratulations to the three of you. I think this has been a kind of tremendous achievement. Thanks to kind of all of the partners.
Recording in progress.
I think when we set up kind of SCIS, one of our key objectives was to build a network of people doing work on kind of inequality from the perspective of countries in the global south. And we thought that that was kind of really sort of really important, because the sense we had at the time was that this kind of question of inequality, although it was most complex and most kind of immediate in the countries in the global south, that the kind of thinking work and the research work was concentrated too much in countries in the global north, and that was part of the inequality that I think we felt we had to address. I think this work that you've all done is a fantastic kind of example and of building a network in the global south, but also the kind of importance of kind of thinking about these issues from the realities of countries in the global south. And I think it's an example sort of par excellence of the importance of work in the global south. So thank you to kind of all of you for that. The last thank you really should be to the IADRC, and kind of in particular Aryan Dahan, who I hope is kind of online and kind of in India, kind of joining us on this kind of in the seminar. I think it was Aryan's kind of idea that it was kind of important to do this work, but also that it was important that it be located in countries in the global south, and that it should be headed by a kind of institution in the global south. The kind of IDRC has been a kind of huge supporter of our center, and I think is one of the international development funders that I think really understands this kind of question of kind of building research capabilities in countries in the global south. So with that, let me then pass it on to kind of Siviwe. We kind of look forward to kind of all of the kind of engagements, and once more kind of a huge congratulations to everyone involved in this project. As I said, I think it's really path-breaking work. So over to you.
Yeah. Thank you, and thank you to Prof. Imran Valodia for the introduction. My name is Siviwe Mhlana, and I'm the project lead for the Promoting Intersectional Development Research Project here at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies. I just also want to give a brief a note echoing Prof. Valodia's excitement for all of you being here today, and the gratitude for your participation and the important work that you've done in helping us achieve all of the lessons that we've learned from this project. So as it's been mentioned, in kind of, I think over the last 2 decades, there's been a growing interest around the inclusion of intersectionality in development research, with a lot of actors suggesting that, looking at issues of inequality, looking at the challenges that we see in many countries around the world, would be better addressed by, kind of approaching these issues with an intersectional lens. And that intersectionality might suggest a more kind of targeted targeted and context-specific ways to deal with this. And we see this growing interest, I think, from the work, I think, in the early 2000s, from the United Nations, various convenings that have kind of focused around issues of gender and women, issues that have looked at race and racism, in xenophobia and other related cases, particularly I think around 2000 and 2001. But more recently, as Imran has mentioned as well, we've seen this growing interest coming from the international development research funding space, where a lot of organizations are quite interested in this idea of trying to understand intersectionality and where it fits in, but also the potential opportunities that intersectionality might bring for addressing, as we've mentioned, the kind of persistent inequalities around the world. But the criticism that has actually come from, I think, proponents of intersectionality has been, there is this recognition, that we don't want to kind of look at these issues from a single axis, but the implementation then of kind of intersectionality in research and policy spaces has been slow to implement. And there are various reasons for this, and we'll get into that discussion through the next couple of days. But one of the main things that we found as part of this working on this project was the significant lack of understanding of what intersectionality is. And I think Hannah can also recall, even in presenting this idea of wanting to do this, there's lots of questions about, okay, what is intersectionality? Like, is intersectionality a theory? Is it an approach? Is it a kind of methodology? How do we do intersectionality? And so a lot of the focus of this project, and so, when we embarked on this collaboration with IDRC, the aims were to really try and actually understand intersectionality and also inform and promote intersectional development research. And so, as Imran mentioned also, a lot of the research on intersectionality was really centered in the global north for various reasons, right? One is on kind of the history of intersectionality, of the concept and how it's being developed over time, but also the funding question, right? So a lot of the projects that have kind of evaluated or explored intersectionality have also come out of these global north institutions. So then the collaboration with this project was really trying to see the application of intersectionality based on the experiences of countries and economies in the global south. And for this, we collaborated with 8 organizations that were based in the global south across different regions, sectors, disciplines, focusing on various development issues and the challenges of communities in the global south, and how even if, and we'll get into the details of that with the synthesis, even if not kind of labeled as intersectionality, what are the opportunities for doing this? And so this was the kind of main focus of the first year of this project in 2023, that was really focused on trying to develop an understanding and also see how intersectionality has been applied in development research projects in the global south. And from this, we had worked obviously with the collaboration of IDRC. The focus of these were also IDRC funded projects that we were able to evaluate and assess with this aim in mind. And then so kind of based on this then, we were able to develop in this first year, while gaining and building, developing this understanding, having our kind of learning dialogues, this eventually kind of culminated into 8 case study reports that were looking at this. So it's actually quite an exciting thing, going from a space where we're saying a lot of this research is being dominated by institutions in the global north, and then suddenly we have 8 case study reports showing that, this is being done in various ways, and it may or may not necessarily be labeled as intersectional, but these are the issues, right, of kind of power, of marginalization, of oppression, and we are because of our context, able to explore this with these issues in mind. So it's not to say that this is a concept that is not relevant to our experiences, but it's actually something that, given our context, we're having to look at things through this lens. And so based on that, then, the aims of this workshop are really to share the lessons that we've learned over almost 2 years working on this project. Engaging with researchers, activists, organizations from the Global South on this concept of intersectionality based on the experiences in the countries and the context where we're located. To then also examine the potential opportunities that intersectionality presents for understanding persistent inequalities around the world. And this, as we get into the findings from the synthesis, you'll see is the intention of this concept, right? It's not doing just research for research's sake, but it's about what do we do with research? How do we apply it? How do we influence policies? Having understood these issues and challenges through this kind of lens. And then finally, we hope to also identify some of the best practices and strategies for integrating intersectionality in policy making, but also at the programmatic level. So where does intersectionality, how do we actually integrate intersectionality in grant making? How do we influence policies? How do we take this research outside of kind of our academic spaces and to areas where we can actually influence change. And so then with that, I think I want to end off there and actually request our case study authors, Dr. Hannah Dawson and Seipati Mokema, to join me to present the lessons from the synthesis report. And mainly focusing on the motivations and the concept itself, but also addressing how we approach this project and also some of the key findings from this project. And so just a brief to introduce our case study authors. Yes. Dr. Hannah Dawson is a senior lecturer in the Anthropology and Development Studies Department at the University of Johannesburg. She was also the previous project lead for this promoting intersectional development research project here at SCIS. She's also a visiting researcher still at the Southern Center. Even though she's moved on, she's still maintaining relationships with us here at the center. She holds a PhD in social anthropology from the University of Oxford, and her research grapples with social, economic, and political shifts stemming from mass unemployment and the ways in which the future of work and welfare is being imagined and transformed in South and Southern Africa. And then Ms. Seipati Mokema has previously worked as a junior researcher for Human Sciences Research Council and as an associate researcher here at SCIS. Her research has influenced policy addressing skills, educational, and employment needs of young South Africans to create and promote sustainable work opportunities and livelihoods. Seipati co-authored and published a book titled Fees Must Fall and Its Aftermath about violence, well-being, and the student protest movement in South Africa. She also published an opinion piece on the lack of leadership and its severe impacts on South African youth and women. Currently, Seipati is a Gender, Youth, and Social Inclusion Research Officer at IWMI South Africa office. Thank you.
It's this first nothing. I'm Dr. Yes. Just it did. What should I?
I think it makes sense if you go first. Yeah.
That's that.
Sorry, so Saviwa is actually going to begin, which means we need her slides. I see you. Okay.
Okay. I thought you wanted to join on the couch and have an intimate discussion about intersectionality. So yeah, so I just wanted to give, I think, some ideas around the concept of intersectionality before we get to its application. So as I mentioned, a lot of this work on intersectionality can be traced to various histories of Black feminism in the United States. And we can decide, how far we want to go back in terms of influences. But there's a lot of work from Black feminist movements like the Combahee River Collective, who have advocated against the exclusion of the experiences of Black women from broader movements of racial and gender equality. In academic scholarship, we see this concept emerging out of the legal context. I'm sure some of you are familiar with Kimberly Crenshaw's work that was looking at anti-discrimination doctrines and trying to show the different ways in which race and gendered identities have intersected to shape the multiple dimensions of Black women's employment experiences. Crenshaw's analysis has highlighted that by failing to account for multiple marginalizations in civil rights cases, courts have effectively centered the experiences of the most privileged members of society. And this basically kind of distorts understandings or analysis on racism and sexism, because it only looks at a small part of a bigger issue, really. But, we also know, and as I mentioned earlier, when we discuss this question of intersectionality, a lot of people are like, oh, but haven't we always been interested in this from the Global South, right? And there's a lot of arguments to say, well, intersectionality in the Global South, or interest around intersectionality in the Global South, have actually existed, long before kind of Western theorization of this concept. And this is particularly because of the social, political, and economic conditions in our context that we know are, intersecting, and the issues that we've had to address around these issues of oppression and domination in these countries. And so in the Global South, you can see that intersectionality expands social analysis by recognizing differentiated vulnerabilities of individuals and communities based on where they are located in the broader social, political, and economic context. And you can see this in some of the work that's been done on Dalit feminism, for instance, that looks at Dalit women's experiences, not just as women, but also in their kind of position within society, but also in the jobs and the work that they're engaged in because of their location within the social system. But we know that this concept, kind of beyond the original influences, has been expanded. It has been, various people have attempted to theorize it in various ways. And I think one of the most important contributions has come from Patricia Hill Collins, who kind of advances these earlier conceptualizations by looking at intersectionality through this lens of a kind of matrix of domination. And so according to her definition, domination encompasses multiple domains of power that constitute specific sites where intersecting oppressions are constructed, developed, and maintained. And so intersectionality can then be useful for revealing the organization of and the interconnections among different forms of power, and for developing strategies for addressing a range of social problems. And so these domains of power that Patricia Hill Collins speaks about is a structural domain of power, which looks at the kind of fundamental power that is contained in structures of social institutions, such as the labor market, education, and health, speaking to kind of the case studies, the issues that the case studies have also addressed. The cultural domain of power, which is about the dominant perceptions and expectations of a given society regarding particular social problems. The disciplinary domain of power, which is about the way in which rules and regulations are applied, which determines people's inclusion within or marginalization from a given social structure. And finally, the interpersonal domain of power, which refers to how people's experiences with multiple forms of power shape their intersecting identities and vulnerabilities to various forms of oppression in society. So part of this project then was also really interested in, intersectionality as a critical inquiry, but also as a praxis. I mentioned earlier that one is about how we understand kind of these social issues and social challenges, but the other is what do we do with that understanding, but also not only what do we do with that understanding, where do we get this understanding from, right? Is this that intersectionality is only
Recording
coming
stopped.
from
Recording in
our
progress.
engagements within academia? And we're speaking about these issues, and just to make examples from our case studies in the informal economy or amongst young women and girls, and issues of kind of sexual reproductive health and rights, how do we actually gain this knowledge? So as a critical inquiry, intersectionality suggests a multifaceted approach for investigating how complex power relations converge to shape social relations, which in turn constitute the diversity of human experiences. And so it's been defined as the application of scholarly or social movement methodologies aimed at intersectional and sustainable social justice outcomes. And I mentioned earlier as well that the focus then of intersectionality isn't just about, research for research's sake, but at its core, there is an interest in kind of social justice. So it is research for social justice. And in this knowledge that we speak of and practice are intricately linked, but they also can come from different experiences. So a lot of then the questions around intersectionality or the criticisms of intersectionality is, okay, well, we don't have a kind of one size fits all approach. This is no single way of doing intersectional research. And then this obviously in kind of social sciences raises issues of kind of applicability, empirical validity as well. But some have actually celebrated this flexibility of the concept, right? Because just as the methods are not all-encompassing, the issues are also not homogeneous, and context is really important in understanding these issues. And maybe this then presents a different way of doing things. And so Hannah and I think some of the experts that we consulted with in drafting the synthesis report spent a lot of time trying to go back to this question then. So then what does this mean, right? So if this is a way of understanding these issues, but there's also a flexibility in how we do it and the methods are not the same, is it actually then a method or is it then a theory? Or does this actually help us to see these issues? Is this a way of understanding these issues and then deciding on the most appropriate ways of doing intersectional research? And so there are various kind of themes then from the kind of research, from the case studies as well, but also in other contributions that have come from scholars around the world that have kind of led this work. And again, Patricia Hill Collins and Surma Bulger, who have done this work on intersectionality, identify kind of the themes or the important themes around intersectional research. So one, of course, since we're partly wanting to also understand this issue of kind of inequality, one thing is about understanding the social inequalities, but not just understanding them as, I would say, based on kind of the experiences of impact, but that they don't just come out of, thin air. These are questions of power, and power is important to understanding why social inequalities arise. And then the other thing is around this kind of multiple domains of power in society. Here, the understanding is about intersecting power relations being based on the systems, on how systems of oppression converge at various points at multiple domains of power. So one, you have issues at a kind of structural level, or you have issues at a societal level, but these are kind of working together towards shaping individuals' experiences in society. And perhaps one thing might, an example might be understandings, and actually Lisa's also in the room, she can speak on some of these issues from experiences of young girls or education, perceptions in society about, education and young girls and women in society, and also structural limitations in terms of health. And we saw this particularly even with the COVID pandemic, for instance, where we saw young girls and women having to absorb a lot of that responsibility because of issues that are already happening at a kind of structural level, right? With a crumbling health sector on one side, with issues of kind of labor markets on another side. And these are all kind of converging to shape experiences of people in society. But I guess another thing that has been very important here, as I mentioned as well, is the context. In different contexts, these domains of power can converge at different points, perhaps, but also the experiences might be different based on different issues, economic issues, or even the legal context within different countries and economies that might shape these experiences of people. So uncovering these experiences of oppression and marginalization within a specific social context then becomes important, particularly those related to the nation state or certain segments of society. And here I made the example of kind of, for instance, workers in the informal economy. What are the legal restrictions, for instance, on informal work, and what are and how do those how does that context shape the experiences of women market traders, for instance, in a particular context. And then intersectional research is also not only concerned with highlighting differences in society, but also looking at the interconnections and relations of multiple categories or points of inquiry. And finally, issues of complexity of social problems are important. And as I mentioned, the goal at the end of the day of doing this work is all about the pursuit of a fair and equitable society. So what are we doing this research for? So these are some of the suggestions that have kind of been proposed in the literature. But as we mentioned, we've done a lot of work with the case study authors from Global South context. And so I'm going to hand over to Hannah to share with you some of that, how we approach this project from a Global South perspective, but also some of the key findings in terms of applicability of intersectionality in the Global South. Thanks.
Yeah, Kathy, just a quick question. Can I move my own slides along with this? Okay, perfect. So do you mind switching to that other presentation you put up first? Okay, so while that's coming up, and hopefully I'll be able to move it because I'm going to need my slides. Let me just say that it's really a pleasure to see you all this morning. I don't know who's online, but I'm hoping many other names I know. And good to be back at the Southern Centre, where I don't get to spend as much time as I like. But it's always good to be back. So thanks, for the invitation, especially from Saviwe to be with you all today. And I also just want to recognize the work that her and Melody have done in making this possible. And to say that while I'm going to be giving the bulk of this component of the presentation, it very much reflects the work of a wider collective, those of all the case study authors, but of course also Sapati, Saviwe, and I'll say a little bit more about the contribution of Professor Shireen Hassim and Dr. Ingrid Lynch, who couldn't be here with us today, but might be online. And building off, so I'm going to dive into, kind of this collective process of learning and what shape that took, and then how that came to shape how we thought through what can we derive, what insights, what learnings can we derive from these different case studies and from this collective process of debate and discussion that reflects that process, which was a contested process, but somehow also does justice to the intellectual and reflexive work that was happening amongst author teams around case studies, but also amongst some of us here at the centre and beyond. But I just wanted to, building on the kind of conceptual background and landscape that Siviwe was describing, I did just want to point you to, if you haven't, I think all of us received the final polished synthesis report on email last week or in the last few days. But in the section which Siviwe was drawing out some of the key ideas, one of the ways in which we came to think about the history of this concept very much was shaped by the contributions in our conversations by Professor Shireen Hassim to think about two genealogies, two trajectories of ideas that come to shape intersectionality. The one reflecting the kind of global North context, but specifically kind of the Black feminist movement within the US. So it's global North, but in a particular frame. And I think that in and of itself is interesting to think with. So a marginalized position, but within the global North as a position of kind of epistemic power. And then the second being a much more complex and layered trajectory or genealogy of intersectionality, which we framed around global South feminisms, reflecting in particular the Indian context, but that region more widely, Latin America and Africa, where there's actually a much longer history of theorizing intersectionally, in particular thinking about anti-colonial movements as they intersect with race and class oppression. And so we wanted to think about these as two trajectories and to think about where they intersect or where they don't. So, and also there's a section in that element of the synthesis report where we also try to, based on a lot of the debate and that we learned from a meeting collectively around the critiques and contestations around intersectionality from the Global South. And so just to say that if you haven't yet read those sections of the report, to do so, and I think this is an ongoing conversation, so to see this as a prompt for further discussion and debate. Okay, so now I'm hoping I'm one of those people, I lecture, so I like to move around, and I need to see I don't have my own notes, so if I had my way, I'd be moving. No, it's fine. Maybe actually, well, yeah, it's fine. Okay, so project approach. Is it possible I can use a microphone instead?
I'm sorry. It took me a lot of lectures, so I'm just perfect.
Okay, yeah, okay, perfect. So, as I said, the synthesis report is really the culmination, and for me it was, being able to come here together was we drafted the synthesis report right at the end of last year. And even though there's elements of it that have continued to be refined, this year, for me, preparing this talk was an opportunity to kind of go back and also reflect now with some months having passed. So for me, and I think this reflects Sapati and Siviwe and others involved, that really the synthesis report is the culmination, as I think about it, of a collective process designed to identify the important lessons on the benefits, limits, and obstacles of incorporating an intersectional lens. And so, the title, again, always very difficult to decide on titles, we described it kind of intersectionality in action. And the reason there was ultimately even though we've tried to capture the conceptual debates in a section of the report, ultimately we were interested in what are researchers, scholars, activists doing to derive intersectional insights, and how then are those put into practice in trying to make a more equitable society or change a specific set of power relations in a particular kind of context. And that, I think, is in and of itself a unique way of kind of entering the conversation, is to think about this concept in practice or in action. So, of course, as you've heard, it reflects this collective process, reflects the partnership between the Southern Centre and the IDRC. And then it's actually more than 8, because some of the case studies were partnerships between 2 or more organizations. And when I was reflecting on this process that we engaged in through the bulk of 2023, I think I've come to think that one way to think about the wider project is that it was a process of community. It embodied a kind of community of inquiry approach, which some of you might be familiar with. That kind of conceptualization of an approach to learning and engagement, but which I think in this context was we were trying to build a community of inquiry, in particular amongst practitioners. So, research practitioners, but also practitioners of social change. And that three of the key, if you look up the kind of theory and thinking around the community of inquiry approach, there's kind of three key elements of it. One, it really centers collaboration and emphasizes the importance of collaborative learning. Two, it really centers what it refers to as kind of dialogic inquiry. So it encouraged dialogue and interaction and sees kind of questioning of ourselves and each other as the site of learning and better conceptualization. And then thirdly, a large emphasis on reflective practice. And really we try to set up, some of the authors who are here will tell us if Matt and Fazana if we did this, but we really tried to emphasize that this was an opportunity to reflect on one's own and organizational practice. So seeing that process of reflexivity as again a site of learning. Okay, so basically the project took place over 4 distinct phases. And I quickly want to say something about phase 1 and 2 and then go into the learnings. So I think I don't want to spend much time on this. We kind of detailed in the report if you're interested, but kind of how did we get to these 8 case studies and these 8 organizations? And basically, because this project was initially birthed out of a conversation with the IDRC, we received 18 possible projects that the IDRC thought might be good case studies for thinking and deriving some of the insights and learning that the IDRC was interested in. We saw, too, that this could be a valuable exercise beyond the IDRC's particular interest in this project. And so basically through a process of evaluating 18 project documents of a variety of sorts, we came to choose the 8 projects that then became the 8 case studies that I hope some of you have had a chance to dip into. And those 8 reflected our desire to have some kind of diversity in terms of geographic representation across the Global South. So we didn't want them to all be case studies from different parts of the African continent, for example. That there should be some diversity in terms of the IDRC focus areas, but more widely different development issues. So even how the panels of the 2-day workshop are structured reflect that diversity and thematic focus. And then methodological approach. So we wanted, knowing the kind of dominance of qualitative methods in intersectional research, we were also interested in trying, where possible, to try and have some mix of both quant and qual methodological approaches. So that was the easy stuff. The much more difficult thing was that many of the projects that seemed, to those of us reviewing these project documents, the most interesting and holding the most possibility for what this project was interested in, didn't necessarily think of themselves as doing their work through an explicit intersectional lens. So there were some projects that used the word intersectionality very much, but we felt as if it was a very shallow kind of understanding or interpretation of intersectionality. And while there were other projects that very rarely used the word intersectional, but seemed to be embedded in an intersectional understanding of power relations as they shape, the structural roots of poverty and inequality, or the ways in which social categories are intersecting. And so what we did was to try and actually not obsess around the word intersectional, but think about how is intersectionality being applied, and were there elements of that application in 3 dimensions. So the first one we looked at was in how the problem or the research question was framed. The second, and we detailed the specifics around these in the report. Second, we were interested in the actual execution of the research and the methodological choices that were made. For example, around identity markers, different levels, so the micro, meso, and macro, and how those are seen to intersect. And of course, thinking about wider structures and systems of power. And then lastly was, this emphasis on to what extent was intersectionality present in the dissemination and the practical application of research. So that's how we kind of got to the final 8. You can't see the font there at all, but what that does show, this is in the final report, is the diversity of country context. So we had India, Brazil, Gambia and Ghana, Lebanon, India, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, India. The Uyghur case study was, I think, 7 or 8 countries, and then the final one was in Nepal. And then, as I said, the second kind of key phase of the project between February to November last year, we, researchers and practitioners from these 8 organizations participated in a kind of online, which now reflecting back, I think one can think of that as a kind of community of inquiry that met monthly to discuss and reflect on the benefits of intersectionality. So we kind of split the first few roundtables by discussing a few key readings, and I think now I could see that they're very different readings I might have proposed now at the end of this project maybe than the ones we chose right at the beginning, but this was very much a learning exercise for myself and those of us on the broader team. So we were, and I think that was valuable, despite, the readings always being limited in some kind of elements, but it provided some central text for us to discuss and engage with on intersectionality as a concept, a method, and a praxis. And then the final set of roundtables were an opportunity to kind of allow case study authors to begin to bring their draft reflections and insights into wider conversation for feedback, etc. But ultimately, and the authors really pushed hard towards the end of last year to finalize their case study reports, which I think we published early this year. Okay, so, and then the phase 3 of this project, which was a very intellectually interesting exercise, but also quite a difficult one, was to then think, how do we take these case studies and how do we try and think across them to draw out key learnings and insights? And so we utilized what we call in the report a kind of cross-cutting comparative approach to distill the key learnings and insights on the application of intersectional lens. And the synthesis report really, I want to emphasize this, although there's 4 authors on the front, the synthesis reports this collective process I've been talking about. So it wouldn't be possible without all the case study authors' inputs. Their case studies make up a very large chunk of the word count. But this report also reflects a range of other conversations, workshops, and inputs, and in particular one where we invited the inputs of Professor Shireen Hassim, who was at WITS for many, many years, but is now at Colton University in Canada, and Dr. Ingrid Lynch, who not only authored papers that fed into this synthesis report, but also actively contributed to a workshop that really allowed us to begin to do this work of synthesizing. And so I think Sephati, Siviwe, and myself very much know that the report reflects those deliberations. Okay, that should say intersectionality in action, key learnings. I don't know why it's not there. Okay, so the way I want to present, you must be careful. I told you I'm good at do a lot of lecturing, so I can speak endlessly. I want to present some of the key learnings and insights not in the format they're in the synthesis report, in a kind of back to front way. So you'll see, other than the 3 principles, I'm presenting them in a slightly different orientation. So the first one is rather something that Siviwe has already alluded to in her introductory remarks, which I think is one of the things that I think over time we came to see as something distinctive and valuable about the particular contribution these case studies could make, and a point we try to highlight in the synthesis report, is that the organizations we partnered with consider research and action as intricately linked and mutually informing. So this is not research for research's sake. This is not research entirely embedded in, or at least only embedded within a scholarly community. It's academic research that has life and legs that move in directions far beyond that. And so that the organizations who were the lead for these IDRC projects, and who the authors of whom are members of these sometimes membership-based organizations, also have mandates to conduct research that informs advocacy, movement building, policy development, and programming. So just to give you a flavor of that, so for example, Forest Action Nepal aims to influence public policy and empower forest-dependent communities, especially marginalized and vulnerable groups, to actively manage forest and natural resources in Nepal specifically. And in their project, which was, I think, a 3-year project funded by the IDRC, which was titled Economic Empowerment of Women Through Forest Solutions, which is, they're reflecting on that particular project as the basis of their case study. That project itself reflects a partnership between Forest Action and grassroots associations and industry federations that is aiming to really kind of address discrimination against women and enhance their economic resources. So a big part of that project was trying to understand the ways in which that discrimination actually works in its intersecting forms, to then be able to better address and enhance the economic kind of capabilities of women in those particular circumstances. And another example, for example, is Internet Lab, which is a policy-orientated research organization based in Sao Paulo, who has a mandate to produce critical and evidence-based analyses to advocate for rights-orientated internet policy. And their project, which was called Recognize, Resist, Remedy, was initiated in collaboration with IT for Change, who were another one of the case study authors, but they wrote distinct reports. And this project really set out to understand the specifics of online hate speech against women and evaluate the responses available in both the legal system, but also in the internet platform policies. So as you can just see from these two examples, that's, I think, also something which was at times, I found my brain being stretched in all sorts of directions, in that we were grappling with a project working in kind of rural Nepal simultaneously to communities working on kind of online hate speech, and we were trying to put these kinds of quite distinct projects in conversation with each other. Another example is, of course, WeGo, who's dedicated to improve the working conditions of the working poor, particularly women in the informal economy, and has a significant track record of generating actionable data to address the concerns of their grassroots worker base. And so I think their study, COVID-19 crisis and the informal economy, you're going to hear a lot more about later. But I think it's, again, a very illustrative example of how WeGo thinks about research and data and action as profoundly intertwined. So many of the projects that became the basis of these case studies were informed by a commitment to participatory action research. That's long affirmed knowledge co-production, which, and the WeGo case study, if you're interested, really unpacks this in more detail than any of the others around knowledge co-production as an idea, but in particular WeGo's long history of incorporating that in a very kind of grounded way. So in the WeGo's case study, it's really committed to ensuring research supports movement building, but also informs both simultaneously local and global advocacy processes. So many of the projects and many of the partner organizations are embedded in this kind of participatory action approach, but simultaneously many of them were also committed to feminist methods and praxis. So actually some of what we thought were the strongest projects to think with around intersectionality were often much more explicitly using the language of feminist praxis. And so that became a large part of what does intersectionality do that kind of feminist praxis doesn't? And that was a large part of our kind of conversation. So of course, as many of you will know, feminist methods and practice, amongst other things, recognize the inevitable entanglement of researchers themselves with the complex power dynamics that mark not only the settings in which we might conduct research, but also the importance of engaging these power dynamics in the actual execution of research. And so we argue in one of the latter sections of the report that I think one of the key learnings for us is that a key element of kind of intersectional praxis as it relates to research is the importance of knowledge co-production and the flattening of hierarchies. And so we show that the case studies illustrate how adopting an approach that values knowledge co-production and what we call non-hierarchical collaboration can enhance research impact. And of course, this flattening of hierarchies aligns with other approaches, especially feminist participatory approaches. So the kind of key takeaway in the synthesis report is that collaboration with diverse participants and organizations representing their interests is crucial, not only for deriving intersectional insights, but also for effectively utilizing findings to drive social change. Okay, so the bulk of the synthesis report centers on these what we call the three principles for deriving intersectional insights. And as I said at the beginning, the kind of key question we were thinking through to write up this report was, what did these organizations do to derive intersectional insights? And the kind of three principles we ultimately landed on, of course, this process is always one of, limiting it to three principles. You have to leave some things out, but we think this covers much of the learnings and reflections. So the first is perhaps very obvious, is the importance of situating research in context, and another way to phrase that is just the importance of the contextual application of intersectionality. The second key principle we titled is the importance of scientific rigor and ethics in identifying social categories. And thirdly, the importance of embracing methodological plurality. So just a few points on those. I should apologize for my very wordy text slides. I mean, I try normally to not have so many words on my slides, but for today it felt helpful. So the case studies really underscore the importance of social but also historical context. So while I think most, at least good social science research, and maybe all scientific research, considers context, an intersectional lens pays particular attention, we argued, to the power dynamics in specific contexts where marginalization and privilege play out. And that an intersectional lens encourages researchers to view social categories like race, gender, and caste as contextually contingent rather than fixed. So, what that then means is that researchers must understand when and where these differences matter the most to most identify who is, for example, most vulnerable in relation to a given issue or in a given context. But also the importance of this process for understanding how and why particular groups are vulnerable. And just a couple examples. Of course, there are many, many more in the synthesis report. But one of the examples, what we call the AUB case study on the challenges Syrian refugee women face in accessing social reproductive health services in Lebanon. Of course, we're thinking today about what is happening in Lebanon. This also was very much on our minds throughout last year. Their case study illustrates how an intersectional lens guided their selection of 4 diverse regions in Lebanon. So I've listed the 4 regions there, and that they chose to focus on these reasons precisely because they were interested in the variations and the intersecting nature of these variations in employment, education, health services, migration history, and familiarity with refugee populations. And so the study reveals, so they already had a kind of intersectional set of understandings to inform the case study or the locations of their studies that allowed them to, I think, deepen their intersectional insights on vulnerability to gender-based violence and social and reproductive health services. And they show how access to these services are influenced not only by the intersection of citizenship, ethnicity, and gender, but they really highlight the importance of regional context or differentiation based on where in Lebanon you are. And then another study which I think highlights this particularly well is the one by Forest Action Nepal. And they were interested in better understanding the forms of discrimination faced by women in forest-based enterprises. And they focus on these two distinct areas, which I probably will not be able to pronounce correctly. One is in the mid-hills and one is in the lowlands, as they describe. And the case study highlights how the selection of these two distinct regions, marked by differences in agroforestry practices, ecological landscapes, and sociocultural groups, intersect with a range of other factors. For example, women's marital status and land ownership patterns that are also distinct across different regions in Nepal. And again, on this point around the importance of kind of contextual application, one of the points we highlight from what we call the WMC case study on the gendered impact of violent extremism, in Sri Lanka, Indonesia, and India, we say offers an example of one of the ways to actually situate the entire research project in context, in a very grounded way. And so in the case study, we draw out, in the synthesis report, we draw out from their case study on what one can learn from investing in what they call a reframing workshop at Project Inception that assisted the team to start building methodologies that are informed by contextual priorities, but also variations. And there's a quote there that comes directly from their case study. So I think the key takeaway for this first principle is that the contextual application of intersectionality is critical, and more widely that context is pivotal to the selection of the relevant social categories and appropriate methods for obtaining intersectional insights. And then moving swiftly along, because I think my time is catching up with me, the second key principle is what we call scientific rigor, but also ethics, importantly, in identifying social categories. And as I think will be obvious to all of you, and I think was very apparent to all the case study authors, was that identifying which social categories are critical to understanding oppression or disadvantage or privilege in a particular context is not only a very complex endeavor, but also one that is extremely context dependent. And that one of the learnings we draw out is the importance of highlighting that it is not often practical to engage every single social category, but it's often not necessary to consider every conceivable identity category and intersection. And actually just the process of deciding which social categories of difference to focus on in and of itself requires intersectional thinking, you might argue. And so we argue in the synthesis report that researchers need to pragmatically determine which forms of different are most prominent or pertinent to the specific inequality or injustice they seek to comprehend and address. And so in the synthesis report, we basically highlight 3 strategies that we think the case studies reveal for going about or thinking about how to going about what social categories to focus on to better understand disadvantage or oppression in a given context. So the one is what you could call contextual sensitivities, reviewing the existing literature, and then thirdly, prioritizing self-identification by communities. So the first one is, of course, I think probably quite self-evident, but really we draw out from the case studies the importance of working closely with communities, grassroots organizations, and other actors familiar with the study context to help refine the scope of social categories relevant to the study's research questions. And several case studies emphasize that such a collaborative approach created the conditions in which marginalized communities are centered, enabling to be able to not only work out what are the salient social categories, but also that this process shaped the the entire research process. So one of the examples that I think, one of the case studies that I think does a really good job of this is the case study by, I'm just giving you the acronyms for now, SEHAT and AGWS. They note that partnering closely with SGBV service organizations help the research team to base their selection of identity categories on the organizations, so on these service-based organizations, on their contextually embedded insights into what ultimately shapes women's access to, accessing various forms of support, those who are victims of gender-based violence. And in particular, the authors of this case study underscore the pivotal role of frontline workers, which I think they make a strong case for this, and I think it's well worth reading the way in which they articulate the importance of frontline workers, so social workers, nurses, the insights they have into, actually the various factors shaping GBV in the context of India, but I think their insight is valuable beyond that context. So they argue that the frontline workers played a vital role in ensuring that the collected data not only deepened their understanding of the differentiated vulnerabilities of young girls and women, but also informed context-based interventions. So they really show like the importance of, there's lots of data being collected outside of formal research. So just the service data that's collected by going and seeking the services in these local NGOs, they have this rich archive of information that is actually deeply valuable to better understanding SGBV. And then the second kind of key learning or strategy is the value of being embedded in the existing literature. So this, of course, is a very obvious one, but nonetheless, I think important to highlight. And the SSWH case study, we have Matt Lowe here with us in the room. They really show how their project was embedded, but a product of a very wide-ranging literature on understanding what shapes maternal health outcomes in the Gambia, and that their selection of identity categories reflected a large body of existing research. And the same was very much true for IT for Change, as well as Internet Lab. I just want to highlight one of the insights from Internet Lab, because they reflect, I think, very profoundly and importantly on the complexities, as they put it, in the attribution and self-definition of race and ethnicity in the Brazilian context. And just a small quote there from them, they note, "We decided to take responsibility as researchers, especially in the definitions of ethnic racial belonging, assuming that we might incur mistakes." They say, "Making mistakes seemed less severe than foregoing consideration of a marker as important as race in the Brazilian context." And then the third one is one that doesn't come so much from the case studies, but rather from our wider discussions in trying to synthesize the case studies, but in particular from the work of Ingrid Lynch and others, and in particular a paper, the citation of which I've put up there. And this reflects, I think, a growing literature that underscores the importance of prioritizing self-identification by communities, especially in parts of the global South. And that this literature highlights how global advocacy agendas may influence the adoption of Northern identity language. So this paper, which I've referenced there, goes into a lot of detail on the kind of imposition of LGBTIQ identity categories in the African context, and how these are often not particularly helpful in relation to more embedded or grounded, as I think the report puts it, African ways of understanding sexual orientation and identity. And so the importance of taking those local categories rather than coming with a preset set of identity categories. So I think the key takeaway for this on the second key principle is that researchers must very carefully identify which forms of difference are most relevant or significant to the particular inequality or injustice they aim to understand and address. So you'll be pleased to know this is the third principle. So again, as I think I already alluded to right at the beginning, intersectional research is dominated by qualitative methods. And this is something that came out very clear right at the beginning of the project when we did a kind of systematic analysis of the existing literature. So there's a real kind of scarcity of quantitative studies applying an intersectional lens, although the global health, public health space is probably one area where there is a growing body of literature that engages intersectionality, but a near complete absence in the kind of STEM fields. And this is another report by Ingrid Lynch, who assisted us in the synthesis very much, where she makes this point much more strongly. So of course, it's not surprising, those of us that are qualitative researchers, that qualitative methods are very helpful for engaging complexity. And so it's therefore not surprising, in a way, that much of what we might call intersectional research is qualitative. And I think the case studies show this in many ways. So the WMC note the choice of qualitative data collection, in particular life histories. Their choice of life histories was informed by the need to understand women's lives in all their complexity. That's how they phrase it. And Forest Action Nepal also outlined the pivotal role of various very interesting qualitative research tools such as participatory mapping, storytelling, and games in facilitating continuous learning and engagement during the research process. But many of the case studies actually employed mixed methods and were combining, in some cases, both quantitative and qualitative kind of research paradigms. And so something we really emphasize in the synthesis report is the importance to recognize that there's no single method that is universally correct or appropriate for intersectional inquiry. The primary objective should be to choose methods that produce intersectional insights and reveal how intersecting oppressions emerge, develop, and are sustained. But that there is we note that there is more to be done in terms of thinking about how intersectionality can be applied in more quantitative methods or approaches. So the kind of key takeaway here for the third principle is that various methodologies are valuable for uncovering interconnected forms of marginalization, but the primary aim of intersectionality-informed research is to ensure the methods one chooses produce insights that reflect intersectional complexities. And then I just want to end with a few reflections on disseminating research for social change. This is the kind of final main section of the synthesis report before we conclude, where we kind of come back to the unique nature of these research organizations, in which, as I said at the beginning, action and research are deeply intertwined, and often the research process itself is seen to be transformative. And one of the readings we discussed in the early roundtables as a kind of collective was this piece by Tanzit Bell. And in that, she outlines strategies for what she calls a politics of accountability to eliminate oppressive relations during research dissemination. And these three, I think, are reflected in various ways in different case studies. So the first is the importance of making research results accessible and usable beyond academic publications, and the importance of targeting that knowledge and those research outputs based on who's going to read them. So that has relevance for form, content, language, etc., etc. The second is really thinking carefully about what the implications are of this research for different actors or agents within this kind of this landscape of power differentials. So, what would be most helpful to inform local government responses? What would be most helpful for particular actors or institutions? And then largely is the importance of ensuring that research benefits the participants and the members of these communities directly. I'm not going to go into these details, but I think I have on the slide how we go, and I think IT for Change demonstrate this, but in the actual report I give many more examples. So another In the report, both in the first section, which Siviwe was drawing attention to, and towards the synthesis of learnings, peppered throughout there are contestations, challenges that I think need to constantly be grappled with in thinking about the value of intersectionality and its applicability. And so some of those are highlighted towards the end of the synthesis report, where we engage some of the dominant critiques. One is, of course, one you'll all be familiar with, is that, does intersectionality ultimately not promote a kind of identity politics that can hinder coalition building? But we think the case studies on the whole show how research processes can deepen. So engaging intersectionally can actually deepen alliances between marginalized groups, communities, academics, and policymakers. But how this application is done is, of course, absolutely critical. So one example is the WeGo case study, and they illustrate how participation in project activities created connections between diverse participants and organizations, reducing isolation and strengthening social movement and advocacy efforts. And yet, at the same time, WeGo also reflect on the tensions, as they put it, in organizing efforts that arise from focusing on differentiated experiences of inequality. And so they argue that forging consensus on addressing these challenges is essential, but also to prevent the weakening and fracturing of organizations, but also that raising awareness of differentiated experiences, and you can think about the value of this also within our own organizations and teams that we might work in. The importance of raising awareness of differentiated experiences should be a path to strengthening organizational internal, what they call their organization's own internal democratic capacities. And I think that insight has value for, more widely. Okay, last slide, the conclusions. We say in this synthesis report that operationalizing intersectionality in development research presents many opportunities, but also many challenges, because, as Siviwe said in the beginning, it functions more as a lens than it does a rigid approach. And so there's still lots that has to be thought through in terms of how one might engage it in a given project or context. Nonetheless, the case studies show how research process... No, there we go. I think, as you've heard, the case studies really highlight the overlaps between intersectionality and other activist traditions, but that these overlaps and tensions, and I think this came out in some of the case studies, in particular organizations that are deeply embedded in a kind of feminist praxis, the ongoing work that they're engaged in to think through the ways in which feminist praxis is already engaged in a process that engages intersectionality, but the need to kind of think more about these overlapping approaches, but also their tensions and trade-offs, perhaps. And I think this work is extremely necessary to ensure that intersectionality is not just applied in a kind of additive manner as a tool. And lastly, I think what's very clear is that the case studies show that the research process, not just the outcomes, are crucial for deriving intersectional insights, but that this requires funders. So the SEHAT AJWS case study really emphasized that what they call intersectional feminist praxis requires donors to also work in ways that they don't necessarily always do. And so I'm just putting a kind of, I think this is very much, their case study is of particular relevance to some of tomorrow's discussions on intersectional grant making. And so the application of intersectionality in development research is still in its early stages, and much of the scholarship, as Siviwe said in the beginning, centers the global north, making these insights, I think, and I hope you'll agree, crucial or critical for advancing a more reflexive use of intersectionality. Research and development organizations, we argue, must prioritize voices and perspectives from the global south to prevent intersectionality from becoming a buzzword that's imposed on practitioners, or one that loses its radical and transformative potential. So thank you for listening to me. I know that was long. And my colleague Sapati, mainly because I put this together so last minute, didn't actually present a section of this, but was absolutely crucial in working with both of us very closely and is please pose questions directly to her too. Thank you.
All right, we're open for discussion session, people. Comments, questions, add-ons, subtractions, divisions. Matt, you want to say something?
Yeah, that's them.
Who? Oh,
You said
over? Okay, Swingy.
where's your line shaking?
Shall I?
So late.
Okay, so I'll just start with a comment. I just wanted to say that I really appreciate the effort taken to synthesize the case studies, and I really appreciate 2 points that you made. One was that it also emerges, the sort of imperative to use an intersectional approach emerges from two histories and not just the one that emerges from the global north, that I really appreciate. So, and also how you ended the presentation by saying not to forget the sort of the imperative for change, which is what motivates all of us. So just wanted to appreciate that.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I just want to say I agree a lot with what you said in the report. I did get to read it yesterday. And for me, talking about this history of intersectionality and how I think we've always been doing intersectional work, research in the Global South, I think it's quite important in terms of how we contest these theories that we come from the Global North. And I think for me specifically, and maybe I'll speak more about that tomorrow, I like to say how growing up in rural Limpopo, I always had this, what's the word I'm looking for? This discomfort around how Black rural women are represented in research and are spoken about. And for me, that was the beginning of my intersectional journey as a young girl, a young woman. So for me, I think that's quite important. And not only in the context of decolonial traditions, but also in the context of grassroots women's experiences and such as mine, and how that has informed our research, has come to inform my research. Obviously, my positionality being quite important. And I think for me, I've seen in your report, you talk about positionality. I think that's quite key in terms of how we do this and we practice this.
Didn't you introduce us?
Oh, I didn't. My name is Jamela Hoveni, and I'm so glad to see some colleagues here, Mike Rogue, and I haven't seen him in a couple of years. We used to be at Rhodes together. So this is quite a nice conference or get together, because we get to see people we haven't seen in a while. Thanks.
To the colleagues online, would just like to ask you to pose the questions or raise your hands so that we can allow you to also speak and participate in the discussions. And to everybody else in the room and online, before you ask a question, please introduce yourself and your organization, if you would like. Go.
Yes. Thank you for the talk. This is super interesting for me to hear. I'm a visiting researcher from a German university, the University of Konstanz, and I'm doing my PhD on climate inequalities in the Global South. My name is Summer Isaacson, and I was just wondering, as I'm doing this work and I'm interviewing people here in South Africa about their experiences with climate inequality, environmental issues, climate protests, these type of issues, I have been reflecting on how I can avoid this issue of just publishing some fancy academic paper that goes into some journal, and then the people that I'm trying to talk to and reach, they never even see it and they don't care. And so you mentioned this dissemination being intersectional and being useful for the communities. I would love to hear some thoughts on methods and ways. What can I do to actually get this out there? Maybe talking to local news or media or something like this, but if you have any specific recommendations, I would really listen to those. Thank you.
Do we have any questions in the room? Another question? Online? Good. Okay. Maybe just take that question and then we'll come back.
Yeah, I'll start. And before I start, I also really want to say thank you, colleagues, to everybody in the room, and also everybody who contributed through their case studies to this report. Also, one thing I specifically wanted to add on is really the importance of intersectional research as a vehicle for social change. So with many of the case studies that were profiled in the synthesis report, I just noted two things. One, the projects, that were led by scholars or researchers tended to use intersectionality explicitly, and with that we also noted that using intersectionality intentionally, it was sort of like putting together a narrative or driving a narrative with the end point of trying to achieve some form of social change. And then the case studies whereby intersectionality was not explicitly used, but you could see traces of intersectionality within the method or the practice of their research. So we would see that their aim was to address a social change, and the end point of that entire project would be get towards social justice. So change and justice are an incredible and pivotal point in intersectional research. And sometimes in my own personal capacity, while going through the case studies, would sort of like remove intersectionality out of my head and just think about research geared towards social change or social justice. And then the other one, I think her name is Summer. Yeah. I'm not sure, but I think this is largely concerned with your research method. So what is really heavy in this learning experience was we noticed that what goes with intersectional research is like a combination of research methods. So a lot of case studies highlighted that they were using participatory action research. So we found that a lot of these case studies would have intersectionality, as a broad overarching research lens or not. But delving deeper, you would find other social sciences research methods that are very much bottom up. The structures like very much bottom up. To achieve social justice and social change. So my advice to you, as a person who has a master's degree, to a PhD student, just fine tune your methodology to ensure that it's very participant orientated. Two, I think one, you can also focus on praxis and dissemination. So by centering your research on your participants, you're already paving the way to including them in the practice and the dissemination. So it's not going to be very difficult for you to start a new process of trying to convince policymakers or communities. You already have built the rapport, you already have your networks, you already have your contacts. So you already include your research participants in the entire research process. So yeah, I don't know how far you are, but I think that's the best I can give. Hannah is a supervisor, so she can advise better, I don't know.
Is this on? Hello? Okay. I just wanted to add to the response to Sama on dissemination. Actually, we're quite fortunate here that some of the case study authors are in the room, and these are organizations that actually deal a lot with kind of working with communities, movements, and part of this is in their dissemination strategy. I won't steal all of Mike's key points, but I think one example would be in kind of WeGo's work, but I think generally, as Hannah also mentioned, the intersectionality doesn't only begin at the point of dissemination. Intersectionality needs to be throughout the research process. And I think questions of dissemination then can be addressed from as early as, you know, the kind of partners and collaborations that you choose to support the work that you do. And there's a lot of examples then in kind of working when we mentioned this question of kind of knowledge co-production and also how we involve communities and movements in both kind of theorizing but also in trying to actually implement change and to address the issues that we're dealing with. So there's that point in terms of how we actually produce this research. And Sepati mentions some examples, participatory research, action research, but I will say that a lot of the research that claims to be participatory research isn't usually as participatory as you would assume, right? So it kind of stops at, oh, I'm doing this project and requesting access. So questions of how you actually work with communities and how do you actually ensure that the project is participatory, and if it is going to be action research as well, then kind of how do we ensure that it actually does inform, for instance, in the WeGo case, advocacy and other issues, right? So yes, you have your intentions as kind of a doctoral students with your own project, but if the intention is for this to actually contribute or to supporting, you know, existing struggles in communities or workers or, you know, whoever you're working with, then it's about trying to see what kind of relationships that you can develop, but also how you can share the information or the lessons that you're learning throughout your research project, so that these organizations that you're collaborating with can actually use that. And I think Mike will speak with on this a little later, but it is about, okay, how do we actually share this information in a quick way, but also in an accessible way so that it can actually be used to support ongoing struggles. But I think that the kind of intersectionality process goes throughout. I see Prof. Hanifa and also Dr. Vibasek as also hands are up as well to give you more suggestions possibly.
Thank you. My name is Tsele Moloi. You spoke about what you've said is most of the work on intersectional research, it's more qualitative. And I would like to believe even your approach in this, looking at those case studies, was qualitative. So, but one of the recommendations that you make is the importance of quantitative. So I would like to understand, how did you came to that conclusion of saying there is importance of quantitative, or is just a recommendation to say, let's look at it quantitatively and see what we get, or there is something that you believe that it is hidden from your qualitative research, that you think quantitative research might be important in elucidating? Thank you.
Just taking off from the conversation about, you know, the question that you asked, great question. I was also thinking, though, that, you know, writing an article for a journal is not a bad thing to do either, because there's a way in which it informs a certain sort of academic understanding of these issues that feed back through, you know, the education that students get, and then students go into the field and interact with communities and, you know, all of that. So I think that's also really important. So my question is, what kinds of plans do you have for that sort of dissemination of these, you know, really important insights that you've created through this project?
Great. I have actually, Fazana, your last question allows me to say what I wanted to say in response to your first point, which was, so thanks for highlighting. I think this conversation we were having, especially shaped by Professor Shireen Hassim, we hope she will publish in a journal article herself these two genealogies, which we summarize, but she wrote a much more extensive elaboration on them. And I think we argue in the synthesis report that, again, it's thinking about these as two, the actual global South feminisms completely predates the US feminist movement one, but to think about them as two trajectories or two, it's also a dynamic evolution of ideas and practice and activism. But we argue towards the end of that section that despite these two trajectories of intersectional thinking having common conceptual foundations, even interestingly, let me finish my first point, that they're still increasingly obscured in the resurgence of the term, which I think, to your point about the importance of actually academic publishing, not just letting the kind of perspectives of Global South scholars and practitioners to get lost, in a sense, in reports or in what some might call the grey literature, but ensuring, so this is something we are very much hoping to attend to in some way, both in thinking about an academic publication that stems from the synthesis report, but also Professor Shireen Hassim in this two trajectories, I think. But the wider point I wanted to make, so basically I agree with your point around actually the importance of academic literature precisely because of epistemic inequalities, and this also comes down to the broader conversation around citational praxis and how to do that through a kind of decolonial kind of lens, is that I myself, in beginning to think about this project, nearly now 2 years ago, was, myself subjected to the existing literature in which Southern scholars and thinkers often, so someone like Leila Gonzalez in the Brazilian context, various Indian scholars and writers, their literature does not come up in the first 200 hits. And so one of the things we tried to do, I think we could have done an even better job, was, but how do we all, in a sense, take responsibility for not just building this archive, but to ensure that our citational practices bring this other genealogy much more into the fore. So much so that actually Global North scholars are engaging with this trajectory in a serious manner. So that was that. Mr. or Dr. Malloy, your point around, so in a way it's rather an observation on the dominance of intersectionality in qualitative methodology, and that there is, and this really reflects some research that Dr. Ingrid Lynch, who assisted us with the synthesis report, has done. So, for example, she's been working on microbial research. Don't ask me anything more about microbial research, but, like deep into, health science, the health sciences. And, in a sense, the social sciences now take so many things for granted. It's in the ways in which we think about gender as being socially constructed. But there are other simultaneous domains of scientific inquiry that are 70 years behind us. And so intersectionality is, in a way, 7 jumps ahead, but it's actually increasingly crucial given the power that quantitative research has, be it economics or be it health sciences, that we have to, as social science scholars, is engage in a process of assisting them actually to begin to take some of the things we now just do without even much thought. And so I think it's part of that wider kind of conversation. But in the report, we in particular engage with this research Dr. Ingrid Lynch has been doing, working with scientists in the microbial research space, and the value thinking intersectionally, which is really actually about thinking about things like gender as a social construction, taking historical context seriously. But it provides a kind of in for those conversations, which she argues is particularly useful. But like I said, it's it's a long road for some researchers. And then just quickly to Summer, I just wanted to, I can give you the reference during the break, but there's a book that came out in the last 2 years around public sociology, which is a reflection on 20 years of research praxis of various researchers at the Society Work and Politics Institute, SWAP, which is at WITS on the main campus, where they reflect very much on the international debates around what is public sociology, different traditions for doing kind of engaged research. So I think that book will be very helpful to you.
Okay. I think we're going to take a... Is there a hand? Oh. Okay.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lisa. I am from the Center for Visual Methodologies for Social Change at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. And we do community-based participatory research at the center. And something that we learned very practically during a recent IDRC-funded project, actually, was that sometimes you just have to ask your participants how they want the research they've been involved in to be disseminated. We were hand-wringing about how to get everybody involved, and we were working with girls and young women, and we were like, well, can we get together and, you know, write an article together that's going to be published in a big fancy journal? And we spoke to them about it, and they were like, yeah, no, thanks. We'd rather not. So, you know, we put all this time and effort and angst into trying to decide how we were going to make our dissemination collaborative at every level, and it just didn't work out that way because they just didn't really want to do it. So sometimes just asking, yeah.
Round of applause for our synthesis report.